An elderly man approached the museum desk. "Sir, that exhibit is closed for donors only," the administrator said, eyeing his threadbare peacoat. "Perhaps you didn't understand. This isn't a VA center." Security gripped his elbow. "Let's go, Pops." The veteran straightened his back and walked out silently into the rain. 20 minutes later, 3 black SUVs screeched to a halt. A 3-star Lieutenant General strode through the crowd, stopping to salute the old Marine. "Do you know who this is?" he thundered. "This man holds the Medal of Honor for saving my father and 27 other Marines at Quang Tri. Before we start, comment where you are watching from. And what do you think about veterans? Do they get enough respect for serving our country?" The autumn wind bit through Jack Harmon's worn Navy peacoat as he climbed the granite steps of the National Military Museum. At 73, his movements were deliberate but steady, the discipline of his 27 years in the Marine Corps evident in his ramrod-straight posture. Jack paused at the top step, catching his breath. The museum's grand facade loomed before him, adorned with flags snapping in the breeze. Today marked 50 years since the Quang Tri offensive, a day etched in his memory not by choice, but by the kind of experience that rewrites a man's soul. He needed to visit the Vietnam exhibit, to stand before the photos of men he'd served with, men who never came home. Inside, the gleaming marble lobby bustled with school groups and tourists. Jack approached the information desk where a young man in a crisp blue blazer scrolled through his phone, barely glancing up as Jack's weathered hands came to rest on the counter. "Excuse me," Jack said, his voice carrying the gravelly timbre of age and authority. "Could you direct me to the Vietnam War exhibit? I understand there's a new display about the 1972 Easter offensive." The young man, his name tag read Ethan, looked up with undisguised impatience. "Sir, that exhibit is closed for a private event today. There's a fundraising reception for museum donors." Jack nodded slowly. "I see. I've come quite a distance. Is there any way I might just have a few minutes to—" "Not possible," Ethan cut him off. "The exhibit is closed to the general public. Museum policy." He turned back to his phone, conversation dismissed. Jack stood motionless, weathering the rejection like he'd weathered artillery fire, with stoic resilience. "I understand policies," he said quietly. "But today is significant for those of us who served at Quang Tri. I only need 5 minutes." A woman in a tailored suit approached, her heels clicking authoritatively across the marble. "Is there a problem, Ethan?" Her gaze flicked dismissively over Jack's worn appearance. "Ms. Harrington, this gentleman wants access to the Vietnam exhibit during the Whitworth reception." The woman, the museum director, judging by her demeanor, pursed her lips. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's absolutely not possible. The Whitworth Foundation has paid considerable money for private use of that wing. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow." Her tone suggested she was being extraordinarily generous with this offer. Jack's weathered hand reached inside his coat, retrieving a small, worn photograph. "Ma'am, 50 years ago today, I was with these men. Half of them never came home. I just want to pay my respects." Ms. Harrington barely glanced at the photo. "Our schedule simply doesn't permit exceptions. The exhibition will be open to the public tomorrow." She emphasized public in a way that made it clear which category she believed Jack belonged in. A security guard had drifted closer during the exchange, standing at alert attention. Ms. Harrington caught his eye meaningfully. "Perhaps you don't understand," Jack continued, his voice steady but his eyes growing distant. "I was with the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines. We held the line at—" "Sir," Ms. Harrington interrupted, "your service is appreciated, but our policies are firm. If you can't respect our private event schedule, I'll have to ask security to escort you out." The guard stepped forward. "Let's go, buddy. Don't make this difficult." Jack's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his cap as he stood his ground. "I'm not looking to disrupt anything. I just want 5 minutes to honor my fallen brothers." Ms. Harrington's patience visibly evaporated. "That's enough. Either purchase a general admission ticket for the other exhibits or leave immediately. This isn't a VA center. It's a prestigious museum with protocols." By now, several visitors had stopped to watch the confrontation. Among them, a school group of teenagers exchanged glances, some snickering at the old man's predicament. Their teacher, absorbed in her phone, did nothing to quiet them. Jack's eyes, sharp despite his years, took in the scene. The dismissive administrators, the indifferent security, the amused teenagers. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in his gaze, a glimpse of the warrior he'd once been. Then it vanished, replaced by something sadder but no less powerful. Dignity in the face of disrespect. "Very well," he said quietly, replacing his cap. "I won't trouble you further." The security guard gripped Jack's elbow unnecessarily. "Let's go, Pops." Jack tensed but allowed himself to be steered toward the exit. Every step across that marble floor echoed like a drumbeat, drawing more eyes to the spectacle of the elderly veteran being escorted out. Most looked away quickly, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. As Jack descended the stairs he'd so laboriously climbed, a young woman in an army dress uniform stood frozen at the bottom, watching the scene unfold with widening eyes. Their gazes met briefly. Jack's resigned, hers shocked. "Sir," she began, stepping forward. But Jack merely shook his head slightly and continued past her. The wind had picked up, threatening rain from darkening clouds. He paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back at the building where the history he'd helped write was housed, but where he himself was unwelcome. The security guard stood at the top of the steps, arms crossed, making sure the old man truly left. Behind him, Ms. Harrington had already turned away, speaking into her radio about final preparations for the Whitworth reception. None of them noticed the Army captain who had witnessed everything pull out her phone and make a call that would change everything within the hour. Captain Sarah Reeves watched the elderly veteran make his way slowly across the museum plaza, his back straight despite the humiliation he'd just endured. Her blood boiled as she replayed the scene. His quiet dignity, the administrator's condescension, the unnecessary force. As an intelligence officer with 2 tours in Afghanistan, she recognized something in the old Marine's bearing that the museum staff had missed entirely. This was no ordinary veteran. Sarah knew she'd seen his face before, not in person, but in briefings, historical accounts of battles that had shaped modern Marine Corps tactics. The name escaped her, but the profile was unmistakable. She scrolled rapidly through her contacts until she found the one she needed. "General Blackwood's office," answered a crisp voice. "This is Captain Reeves. I need to speak with the general immediately. It's about a situation at the National Military Museum that requires his attention." Inside the museum, the incident had already begun rippling outward. A middle-aged man who had watched the confrontation approached the information desk, his face tight with controlled anger. "Excuse me," he said to Ethan. "That man you just had removed, did I hear correctly that he served in Vietnam?" "At Quang Tri." Ethan shrugged. "Look, mister, we have policies. The exhibit's closed today. I'm Dr. James Connor, Department of Military History at Georgetown." He placed his business card on the counter. "And if that man is who I think he is, you just thrown out someone this museum specifically honors in its Vietnam collection." Behind him, other visitors had begun to gather, murmuring among themselves. Someone had recorded the incident on their phone, and people huddled around the screen, replaying the scene. "Did anyone catch his name?" asked a woman wearing a Memorial Day Run for Veterans t-shirt. "I think I recognized him," said an older gentleman leaning on a cane. "If it's who I think it is, Jack Harmon, then good Lord, what have they done?" The name rippled through the growing crowd. Even some of the teenagers who had laughed earlier looked uncomfortable now as their teacher, finally paying attention, explained in hushed tones who Jack Harmon was. Miss Harrington emerged from a side door, immediately sensing the change in atmosphere. The lobby had become unnaturally quiet, with dozens of eyes turning toward her. "Is there some kind of problem?" she asked, her professional smile firmly in place. Dr. Connor stepped forward. "Did you just have Master Sergeant Jack Harmon removed from this museum?" Miss Harrington's smile faltered slightly. "I don't know the gentleman's name." A visitor was attempting to access a closed exhibit and became disruptive when denied. Disruptive? A new voice joined the conversation. The Army captain who had witnessed everything. Sarah Reeves stepped into the circle that had formed around the administrator. "I saw the entire incident. That man was nothing but respectful while being treated like an unwelcome intruder. And you are? Miss Harrington asked coolly. Captain Sarah Reeves, U.S. Army Intelligence. And unless I'm mistaken, you just had Medal of Honor recipient Master Sergeant Jack Harmon escorted from this building on the anniversary of the action that earned him that medal. A collective intake of breath swept through the lobby. Miss Harrington's face paled slightly. Medal of Honor, she repeated, her voice losing its authoritative edge. The same Jack Harmon whose tactical decisions during the Easter offensive saved his entire company? Dr. Connor asked. The Marine who's featured in your own exhibit on Quang Tri. Ms. Harrington glanced toward the security guard, who looked equally unsettled. There must be some mistake. The gentleman didn't identify himself as. Of course he didn't, Captain Reeves cut in. Medal of Honor recipients rarely announce themselves. It's not their way. Outside, Jack Harmon had made his way to a bench across from the museum. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, looking at the building with an expression that held no bitterness, only a deep, resigned sadness. The first drops of rain began to fall, but he made no move to seek shelter. Back inside, the situation was spiraling beyond Ms. Harrington's control. Visitors who had overheard were on their phones, some apparently sharing the story on social media. Dr. Connor was in heated conversation with a group that included several veterans who had been touring other exhibits. This is precisely what's wrong with how we treat our heroes, one man was saying loudly. Relegated to a display case, but not welcome in person. Ms. Harrington retreated to her office, closing the door against the growing commotion. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her phone to call the museum's public relations director. Outside her window, she noticed several news vans pulling into the parking lot. How had this escalated so quickly? She didn't see Captain Reeves slip away from the crowd, returning to the plaza where Jack still sat in the now steady rain. The captain approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away and rendering a perfect salute. Master Sergeant Harmon, she said, I'm Captain Sarah Reeves. I wonder if you might wait just a few more minutes before leaving? There's someone who very much wants to speak with you. Jack looked up, raindrops tracking down his weathered face. I think there's been enough commotion for one day, Captain. Sir, Lieutenant General David Blackwood is on his way. He asked specifically that you wait for him. Jack's expression changed subtly at the name. David Blackwood? Yes, sir. He said to tell you that the Hornet's son hasn't forgotten what he owes you. Jack's eyes widened, and for the first time since his rejection at the museum doors, a small smile crossed his face. Little Davy Blackwood. Well, I'll be damned. As they spoke, 3 black SUVs with military plates pulled up to the curb. Museum security personnel scrambled to attention as uniformed military staff emerged from the vehicles, quickly establishing a perimeter. The museum plaza, nearly empty moments before due to the rain, was suddenly alive with activity. From the lead vehicle stepped a tall man in full dress uniform adorned with the 3 stars of a lieutenant general. Despite the rain, he wore no cover, allowing the water to soak his close-cropped gray hair as he scanned the area with piercing eyes. Through the museum's grand windows, stunned staff and visitors watched the procession. Ms. Harrington, alerted by security, hurried from her office just in time to see the lieutenant general stride purposefully toward the bench where Jack Harmon sat with Captain Reeves. What happened next would be captured on dozens of phones and would be trending online within the hour. Lieutenant General David Blackwood moved with the decisive authority of a man accustomed to command. Yet as he approached the bench where Jack Harmon sat, something in his bearing shifted. The hardened military leader seemed, for just a moment, like a young boy again. He stopped 3 paces from Jack and rendered a perfect parade ground salute, holding it as rain coursed down his uniform. Master Sergeant Harmon, he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the patter of rainfall. It's been too long, sir. Jack rose slowly to his feet, returning the salute with the precision that decades couldn't erase. General Blackwood, you've done well for yourself, son. The general's professional demeanor cracked as he stepped forward and embraced the older man. Everything I've done started with what you taught me, Sergeant. By now, A crowd had gathered despite the rain. Museum visitors, staff, passers-by drawn by the unusual sight of a three-star general embracing an elderly man in a worn peacoat. Through the museum's windows, dozens more watched, including Miss Harrington, who had gone deathly pale. General Blackwood turned toward the museum, his face hardening as he surveyed the building. Captain Reeves informed me of the situation. I understand you were denied entry to pay respects to your fallen brothers on today of all days. Before Jack could answer, the museum's main doors burst open. Miss Harrington rushed out. An umbrella hastily opened above her, security personnel trailing behind. General Blackwood, she called, professional smile firmly in place despite her obvious distress. What an unexpected honor. I'm Catherine Harrington, director of... I know who you are, Ms. Harrington. The general cut her off, his voice arctic. What I don't know is why a Medal of Honor recipient was just forcibly removed from this museum, a museum that exists to honor the very sacrifice men like Master Sergeant Harmon made. Ms. Harrington's smile faltered. There's been a terrible misunderstanding, General. Had we known the sergeant's identity? His identity? General Blackwood's voice rose, silencing her instantly. You mean the uniform he no longer wears? The medals he's too humble to display? Is that what determines who deserves respect in this institution? The crowd had grown silent, rain forgotten as the confrontation unfolded. Several uniformed service members who had been visiting the museum had joined the onlookers, standing at attention despite being in civilian clothes. Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside, Ms. Harrington suggested, gesturing toward the doors. We'd be honored to have Master Sergeant Harmon tour the Vietnam exhibit now. The Whitworth reception can certainly accommodate. You misunderstand me, Director, General Blackwood interrupted. I'm not here to negotiate special treatment for Sergeant Harmon. I'm here because 50 years ago today, this man saved my father's life and the lives of 27 other Marines at Quang Tri. A murmur ran through the crowd. The general turned to address them directly, his voice carrying across the plaza. Many of you may not know this man. Let me tell you who he is. He placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. Master Sergeant Jack Harmon earned the Medal of Honor, leading a rearguard action during the Easter Offensive. When their position was overrun, he carried 2 wounded Marines, including my father, to safety through enemy fire. Jack looked down, uncomfortable with the attention. General Blackwood continued. After bringing them to safety, he went back, not once, but 7 times, to retrieve others. When ammunition ran low, he collected weapons from the fallen. When the radio was destroyed, he used signal mirrors to coordinate air support. For 15 hours, he held that position until reinforcements arrived. The crowd had grown utterly silent, rain forgotten. Even Ms. Harrington stood transfixed. But that's not why I'm here, the general said, his voice softening. I'm here because after Vietnam, when my father came home broken in body and spirit, Jack Harmon visited us every month for years. When my father took his own life, Jack Harmon was the one who explained to a 10-year-old boy what PTSD was. He was the one who made sure I understood my father died a hero, not a coward. Jack reached out, gripping the general's arm. David, no, Jack. They need to hear this. The general's voice grew stronger. This man put me through college. He attended every football game, every graduation. When I earned my commission, Jack Harmon was the first person I saluted. His voice broke slightly. He became the father I lost. Through the museum windows, several of the wealthy donors gathered for the Whitworth reception had pressed against the glass, watching. One elderly gentleman in an expensive suit pushed through the doors, striding toward the scene with purpose. General Blackwood, he called. Raymond Whitworth, sir. My foundation is hosting today's reception. He extended his hand, first to the general, then to Jack. Master Sergeant Harmon, it would be our profound honor if you would join us as our guest of honor. Jack hesitated, but before he could respond, another voice called out. That won't be necessary. All eyes turned to see an elderly man in a wheelchair being pushed forward by a military aide. Despite his advanced age and frail appearance, he wore his naval dress uniform with immaculate precision. 4 stars adorned his shoulder boards. Admiral Porter, General Blackwood acknowledged with a crisp salute. The Admiral nodded in return, but focused on Jack. Harmon, damn good to see you again, Marine. Jack straightened instinctively. Admiral, I was already on my way to this dog and pony show when I got word of what happened. Admiral Porter's eyes swept over Ms. Harrington with withering disapproval. Seems the museum has forgotten who built the legacy they're trading on. Ms. Harrington stepped forward, desperation evident. Admiral Porter, please understand. The Admiral raised a hand, silencing her instantly. Young woman, today marks 50 years since the Easter offensive. Men like Jack Harmon wrote history with their blood while you were still in diapers. He turned to the museum security guard who had escorted Jack out. You, what's your name, son? The guard swallowed hard. Kevin Wilson, sir. Were you in the service, Wilson? No, sir. My father was Army, though. And what would your father say about how you treated a Medal of Honor recipient today? The guard's face crumpled. He'd be ashamed of me, sir. Throughout this exchange, Jack had remained quiet, increasingly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Now he spoke up. That's enough. The boy was following orders. As for the rest, he gestured toward the museum. It's just a building. The men I came to honor aren't in there. They're here. He tapped his chest. A profound silence fell over the assembly. Nevertheless, Admiral Porter said finally, some corrections are in order. He turned to Ms. Harrington. Director, effective immediately, this museum will implement a new policy. Any Medal of Honor recipient, any combat wounded veteran, any Gold Star family member will have full access to this institution at any time, without charge. Of course, Admiral, Ms. Harrington stammered. Furthermore, the Admiral continued, I propose an immediate addition to your Board of Trustees. 3 seats reserved for combat veterans, one of whom will be Master Sergeant Harmon, should he accept. All eyes turned to Jack, who looked genuinely startled. Admiral, I'm not qualified for her. Nonsense, General Blackwood interrupted. Who better to guide a military museum than those who live the history it preserves? From the crowd, spontaneous applause erupted, growing into a thunderous ovation that echoed across the plaza. Even the rain seemed to respond, lightening to a gentle mist as sunlight broke through the clouds. Throughout the plaza, people stood at attention. Veterans saluted. Civilians placed hands over hearts. Museum staff, including Ethan from the information desk, looked on in shame and awe as the truth of what had transpired became clear. Ms. Harrington, recognizing the magnitude of her error, approached Jack directly. The crowd hushed to hear her words. Master Sergeant Harmon, she said, her voice unsteady. On behalf of this institution, I offer my deepest apology. There is no excuse for how you were treated today. She swallowed hard. My grandfather served in Vietnam. He never spoke of it, and I never asked. Perhaps that's part of the problem. We stop asking, stop listening, start forgetting. Jack studied her face for a long moment, then offered his hand. Apology accepted, ma'am. Another wave of applause washed over the plaza. As Jack turned to follow Admiral Porter and General Blackwood into the museum, the security guard, Kevin, stepped forward. Sergeant Harmon, he said quietly, I just wanted to say, my father would have been honored to meet you. I'm sorry for how I treated you. Jack paused, then reached into his pocket and withdrew the worn photograph he'd shown earlier. Your father was Army? Yes, sir. 101st Airborne. Vietnam, 68 to 69. Jack nodded slowly. Good men, the Screaming Eagles. He handed Kevin the photo. These are my men at Quang Tri. When you look at them, think of your father. Same kind of men. Same courage. Kevin accepted the photo with trembling hands, eyes wide with the understanding of what he was being entrusted with. As Jack turned to enter the museum, flanked by General Blackwood and Admiral Porter, the crowd parted respectfully. The museum staff stood at attention, heads bowed in contrition. Ms. Harrington held the door herself, the gesture small but significant. No one who witnessed what happened that rainy afternoon would ever forget it. least of all the museum staff who had failed to recognize the quiet valor walking among them until a three-star general arrived to remind them what true respect looks like. 1 month later, a very different scene unfolded at the National Military Museum. The same granite steps where Jack Harmon had been turned away now featured a new addition, a small bronze plaque reading, "No hero walks alone." Beneath these words was the simple outline of combat boots, a silent reminder of the men and women who had worn them in service. Inside, the lobby hummed with activity as a special exhibition opened. The Faces of Valor, personal stories from Quang Tri. Center stage in the display was a blown-up version of Jack's worn photograph, the one he'd shown to Ms. Harrington and later entrusted to Kevin, the security guard. Kevin himself stood nearby, now wearing a new badge identifying him as Veteran Liaison, a position created in the wake of what staff now refer to simply as that day. His role, to identify and properly welcome veterans and their families, ensuring no hero ever again felt unwelcome. It changed everything, Kevin explained to a group of young military cadets touring the facility. 1 month ago, I made the worst mistake of my career. Today, we're making sure it never happens again. The cadets listened intently as Kevin recounted the story, now a cautionary tale told to all new museum employees during their orientation. Near the Vietnam exhibit, Ms. Harrington guided a group of elderly veterans, her approach transformed. Where once she had projected efficient authority, she now displayed attentive respect, listening more than speaking as the men shared memories triggered by the displays. This section has been completely redesigned with Master Sergeant Harmon's input, she explained. We've added first-person accounts beside each tactical description. The human element was missing before. One of the veterans nodded approvingly. Makes all the difference. History isn't just dates and maps. It's people. In the museum's boardroom, Jack Harmon sat at a large table with General Blackwood, Admiral Porter, and Raymond Whitworth of the Whitworth Foundation. They reviewed plans for a new initiative, the Veterans Voice Project. The funding is secured, Whitworth was saying. Every school group that visits will hear directly from a veteran. Living history, not just artifacts. Jack studied the proposal thoughtfully. In the weeks since that day, he had reluctantly accepted his appointment to the museum's board, despite his protest that he was just a Marine, not an administrator. The key, Jack said, is to connect these kids to the human beings behind the uniforms. They need to understand that every item in this museum was carried, used, or worn by someone with hopes and fears just like theirs. Admiral Porter nodded. That's why your input is invaluable, Jack. You never lost sight of the humanity behind the history. The door opened, and Ethan, the information desk attendant who had first dismissed Jack, entered carrying a tray of coffee. His demeanor had changed dramatically. Gone was the bored indifference, replaced by attentive professionalism. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, setting down the tray. "Master Sergeant Harmon, there's a group of Marine recruits in the lobby. Their drill instructor wondered if you might have a few minutes to speak with them." Jack glanced at his colleagues. "If you'll excuse me?" General Blackwood smiled. "By all means. Those young devils need to meet a real Marine." In the main hall, Jack found himself surrounded by fresh-faced recruits still adjusting to their close-crop haircuts and rigid posture. Their drill instructor, a hard-faced staff sergeant, called them to attention as Jack approached. "At ease," Jack said with a small smile. "You're making me feel like I need to inspect your footlockers." One young recruit, barely 18 by the look of him, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, is it true you went back for wounded Marines 7 times under enemy fire?" Jack's expression sobered. "Son, when you were those Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, the man next to you is your brother. You don't leave your brother behind. It's that simple." The staff sergeant nodded in silent understanding, the kind that passes only between those who have stood in harm's way for others. Across the museum, similar scenes played out throughout the day. The Vietnam exhibit, once just a sterile collection of artifacts, had become a place of pilgrimage and connection. Veterans who had never spoken of their experiences, even to their families, found themselves sharing stories with strangers who stopped to listen. As afternoon faded to evening, Jack found himself back at the bronze plaque by the entrance steps. His fingers traced the outline of the combat boots as memories washed over him. Not just the Quang Tri, but the men he'd served with across his 27 years in uniform. Quite a change from your last visit. Jack turned to find Ms. Harrington standing nearby, her expression reflective. Yes, he agreed. Quite a change. I've been meaning to ask, she said carefully. That day, when we turned you away, you could have identified yourself. Told us about your Medal of Honor. Why didn't you? Jack was quiet for a long moment. The medal was never the point, he said finally. I didn't come here as a Medal of Honor recipient. I came as a Marine who lost friends 50 years ago and wanted to honor their memory. He looked toward the entrance, where visitors continued to arrive, even as closing time approached. The medal belongs to them as much as to me. Ms. Harrington nodded slowly. I understand that now. I didn't before. She hesitated. My grandfather, the one who served in Vietnam, I found his journals after he passed. I never knew what he carried all those years. Most veterans don't talk about it, Jack said. Doesn't mean they don't remember. That's why this matters. She gestured to the transformed museum behind them. Not just preserving history, but honoring the people who lived it. As they spoke, a school bus pulled up. Despite the late hour, a group of high school students filed out, led by a teacher who approached Jack and Ms. Harrington. Master Sergeant Harmon, the teacher asked. I'm sorry we're arriving so close to closing time. We've been studying the Easter offensive, and when the students heard you might be here today. Jack looked at the eager young faces and felt a familiar responsibility settle on his shoulders. The same weight he'd carried since Quang Tri, the obligation to ensure that sacrifices weren't forgotten. The museum may be closing, Ms. Harrington said before Jack could respond, but I think we can make an exception today. She smiled at Jack. After all, history doesn't keep office hours. Later that evening, long after the museum had officially closed, the lights still burned in the Vietnam exhibit. Jack sat surrounded by high school students, pointing to his old photograph, now prominently displayed, as he spoke of men who had been their age when they went to war. The students listened with rapt attention, seeing beyond the elderly man to the young Marine he had once been. No phones distracted them. No side conversations broke the spell of living history shared firsthand. In the doorway, General Blackwood watched silently, remembering how this same man had sat at his childhood bedside, explaining why his father's nightmares didn't make him any less of a hero. Kevin stood guard nearby, no longer just a security officer, but a custodian of respect. He wore a small pin on his uniform now, a replica of combat boots, matching the bronze plaque outside. As Jack's story wound to its close, one student raised her hand. Sir, if you could tell young people one thing about service and sacrifice, what would it be? Jack considered the question carefully, aware of the many eyes upon him. Not just the students, but Ms. Harrington, Kevin, General Blackwood, and the ghosts of men long gone whose presence he felt most strongly in this place dedicated to remembering them. Honor isn't just something you earn once, he said finally. It's something you live every day. The men I served with, the ones who never came home, they don't need marble statues or glass cases. They need us to live lives worthy of their sacrifice. A profound silence fell over the group as his words sank in. Then, quietly, a different kind of education continued, one measured not in test scores or academic standards, but in the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. Outside, the autumn wind still blew, but this time it carried something different across the museum plaza. Not the sting of dismissal, but the warm certainty of welcome. The same granite steps where Jack had once been turned away now promised that no hero would ever walk alone again. And all because one man had stood with quiet dignity in the face of disrespect, and a 3-star general had remembered what true honor looks like.